My story starts out with a young college graduate who became a preacher. He was a good speaker. And he got a job as a preacher in a small town. And during that time, the churches were not very big. Now, the sermons that he gave were always positive and were never about sin or fire and brimstone. The congregation always went home happy because he let them know that they were loved by God. The most appealing thing that people noticed about him was that his speeches were 20 minutes long, never more or never less. And after he finished, the choir would sing, and then everyone would go home. The people were pleased that the sermons were so brief and that time wasn't wasted. The sermons were always 20 minutes long every time he preached. Now, a friend in the congregation was wondering why his sermons were exactly 20 minutes long every Sunday. So he decided to ask. The preacher replied, "Well, that's simple. Right before I get ready to give a sermon, I pop a lifesaver, and when it's gone, that tells me that it's time to stop." The congregation grew, and people from all over would come to hear him preach. He was a good preacher, and the congregation was made up of good people too. They always went home happy. People didn't mind giving donations to the church because they enjoyed hearing him preach the love of God, but they wouldn't pay just to hear sermons about the wages of sin. The money that was collected never amounted to much, even though the congregation grew and grew. People were having to sit closer and closer together, all bunched up. There was one woman in the congregation who didn't like having to sit so close to her husband. She didn't want this to happen, but had no choice. Once she got over it, they seemed to come closer together again, in a loving way. Finally, it became so crowded that the walls were bursting, and the church windows seemed like they were ready to pop out. Because the money collected was so little, the church didn't have much money. And when the preacher went to buy a suit, it had to be an inexpensive one. And his wife was a clever woman. She knew that 3 buttons on the cuff meant an inexpensive suit. She got more buttons and sewed one on each cuff so that there were 4, and this made the suit look more expensive. While he was preaching one day, one of the buttons was dangling from the cuff. So he stuck it in his pocket. On one Sunday, he began the sermon, and everything was going as usual. Then he realized that he had run over time, but the lifesaver was still in his mouth. Finally, his wife stood up in the back of the room and waved for him to stop, which he did, but he couldn't figure out what in the world happened. He took out the lifesaver and realized that it was the button instead. This is the story that I like so very much.